Honey. Honey, wake up. It's an earthquake. Get William.
Earthquake? You have William? Where's William?
I thought you got him.
I thought you said you had him.
No, I told you to go get him.
Oh, no. What was that?
I don't know.
When you peel back the pre-Columbian history of the United States, you might just find the Book of Mormon. Hidden in the Heartland. One of the most revered sections of all Scripture is found in the Book of Mormon, in 3 Nephi chapter 11, when Christ comes to the Nephites. But before his arrival, destruction marked the sign of his death in Jerusalem. Rod Meldrum explains.
It starts off, actually, it says, in the 34th year, in the first month, on the fourth day of the month, there arose a great storm like they'd never seen before. It talks about whirlwinds. It said there was earthquakes. It talked about it shaking the whole earth. It talked about the entire face of the land was changed. The cities being burned and sunk into the depths of the sea, or others being covered over with earth. It talked about cracks. The highways were broken up. There's a whole listing of cities that were burned. And it also talks very much about this mist of darkness that came up, and it lasted for 3 days. And it was so dark that they couldn't even build a fire, it says, even with their best dry wood. A lot of people have really wondered about what caused all that destruction. And when you take a look at the Book of Mormon, it gives about 28 actual observations that were made by the prophet Nephi that describes the destruction that was happening there. A lot of people have thought that the volcanic eruption is the only way you can really understand that. But nowhere in the Book of Mormon does it ever say anything about it being volcanic in nature. In fact, the word volcano doesn't even show up in the text. What could have caused all this destruction, and where did this happen? And is there any evidence to support the claims of the Book of Mormon? And the answer to that actually comes in a very interesting place. It's in the heartland of North America. There's a place called the Newmadrid seismic zone.
Located just south of St. Louis, Missouri, Newmadrid is a small town that sits right on top of a fault line in a major seismic zone on the banks of the Mississippi River. Here was the home of the biggest series of earthquakes recorded in the United States, and yet it is known as the earthquake America forgot.
In 1811 and 1812, there was actually an entire series of earthquakes. By the best accounts and the documentation that we have, there was over 2,000 earthquakes. 3 of them were over 8.0 magnitude. And it basically was felt throughout the heartland of North America.
By comparison, the Great Earthquake of San Francisco in 1906 was measured at 7.8 on the Richter scale.
As it spread out through the heartland of America, it actually rang church bells in South Carolina. It knocked dishes and glasses off the shelves up in Boston. It was felt clear into Canada. It caused all kinds of amazing things that nobody had ever seen before, changing the entire surface of the land. It caused a piece of land to be heaved up to the point that it actually dammed the Mississippi River. And that water hit this dam and it went rushing back upstream. By some accounts, it was a 30-foot tall wall of water that rushed upstream, just destroying everything in its path. Little Prairie was a small town that was there on the banks of the Mississippi, and it was completely flooded. In fact, there was a Native American encampment that was going on there, was completely destroyed. In fact, it was never even heard from again. There was at least 4 different lakes that just drained into the ground. The ground just opened up, the lake just started draining into it, and there was fish flopping on the surface as the lake drained away. There was at least 10 different lakes that were actually formed at that point in time. In fact, there was an entire region of 3,000 square miles that literally just fell, just subsided over 10 feet. The Mississippi River, because of the damming of it, poured into the massive depression and caused a huge lake to form in just a few hours.
Reelfootlake didn't exist before 1812, having been created as a result of the lowering of the land and the flooding of the Mississippi River. Evidence of this comes from the existence of the bald cypress trees, which survived the flood. These trees have a special root system called knees, which form a bulb at the base. Years after the earthquake, the trees created a second bulb where the water level peaked. Many events surrounding these massive series of earthquakes could correlate with the destruction spoken of in the Book of Mormon. But what of the 3 days of darkness? One explanation given is the massive geysers of sand shooting out of the cracks in the ground, known as sand blows, that stretched out for miles. Also, thick vapors of sulfur were recorded by many eyewitnesses in a book called The Earthquake America Forgot.
Underlying the Mississippi River Valley, there's 3,000 feet of sediments that are underneath there. And when this shaking happens, it causes the ground to pressurize, and it causes all kinds of other interesting things, like, for example, sand geysers. The whole region down there is actually a different color if you look at it on Google Earth, because of the amount of sand that was blasted up from the bowels of the earth. Down inside of there are different kinds of gases, things that have been decomposing and so forth, and that's 3,000 feet of sediment, and it's releasing these gases, and they can be either flammable, like methane gas, or it can be sulfur dioxide, for example, which is non-flammable. There's Eliza Bryan, and she became later a school teacher in the New Madrid area, and she wrote of her experience. She said, quote, "My ma tried to light the lamps, but the darkness was so dense, they didn't help at all." She spoke of the, quote, "the awful darkness of the atmosphere," unquote, during some of the daylight shocks. There were others. For example, Godfrey Lesueur. He said, quote, "A dense black cloud of vapor overshadowed the land." Another New Madrid resident exclaimed, "The air would be clear at first, but in 5 minutes it would become very black, and this darkness returned after each successive shock." This is another interesting one. It says, quote, "A vapor seemed to impregnate the atmosphere, had a disagreeable smell, and produce difficulty of respiration." The naturalist John James Audubon, he was the founder of the Audubon Society, he observed what may have been the same phenomena from a bluff in Kentucky. It was about 40 miles away from there. And on January the 23rd of 1812, this is when one of the largest earthquakes hit, he said, quote, "I saw a sudden and strange darkness rising from the western horizon and heard what I imagined to be the distant rumbling of a violent tornado." This is from this minister. He reported that from December the 16th until December the 19th, he says, quote, "The sun, moon, and stars were concealed by a mist and fog which dropped like a heavy dew."
Archaeological evidence shows that this was not the first time a quake of this magnitude existed. Dates suggest that sand blows as a result of earthquakes erupted around 1400 AD, 900 AD, 300 AD, and even before the time of Christ. The recorded death count of the 1811 and 1812 quakes were estimated to be about 100 people, but this was at a time when the westward expansion was still young. With today's infrastructure, it's estimated that up to 11 million people would be affected. One characteristic of the Nephite people was the use of metallurgy. In 2 Nephi chapter 5, it speaks of Nephi teaching his people to work all manner of wood, iron, copper, brass, steel, gold, and silver. Many say that advanced uses of certain metals simply didn't exist anciently in North America. But plenty of evidence shows that the Hopewell Mound builders were aggressive users of silver, copper, and gold, as seen here at Hopewell Culture National Historic Park. One man presents evidence of smelting iron tools long before European settlements in his book Iron Age America Before Columbus. Author William Connor talks about his adventures with an amateur archaeologist, Arlington Mallory, who after World War II focused his life on the idea that other advanced people lived here before Columbus's discovery in 1492.
Arlington Mallory believed that North America had been visited by or even colonized by Europeans before 1492, especially way up north in the seacoast there.
One main piece of evidence is the existence of a number of iron and copper furnaces spoken of in his book.
But Spruce Hill is almost certainly the type of hill fort that was common in northern England and other places in the Old World. But he was very interested in Spruce Hill because he believed it was a hill fort of European design, and he found evidence of iron furnaces along the rim of the plateau. It would make a lot of sense because Spruce Hill sticks way out in the valley and it gets all this upward air, and it's very windy up there. It's a perfect place for furnaces.
Connor claims to have found over 30 locations in Ohio where ancient furnaces once existed.
It turns out that 32 sites that I and my colleagues identified with at least one common thing, and that would be a glazed stone that had been part of a hearth matrix in one of these furnaces. Not only are they glazed, but there's a lot of them that are green glazed. This is a brick from a Lynn Acres furnace.
In his personal collection, Connor shows how the green glazed material found near the furnaces is evidence of iron being smelted.
The stones are trash. You don't take them anywhere. When you're done with the furnace, you leave them. When people would use the furnace, they would leave the junk behind, the debris. And that's how we found them.
The most prized piece in his collection is this broken mold with the casting still inside.
It was found still encased in a clay mold. And it's shaped just like an ordinary stone hand axe. It's something more useful than a stone hand axe because of its weight. It did a lot better job of smashing things up than a stone hand axe. And to me, this signaled the fact that whoever used that knew how to cast iron. And since the mold was still attached, they knew they knew how to pour it into a mold.
In his book, Connor quotes an earlier explorer of the ancient antiquities of the state of Ohio. In exploring Spruce Hill in 1820, archaeologist Caleb Atwater explains,
"There appears to have been a row of furnaces or smith shops where the cinders now lie many feet in depth. I am not able to say with certainty what manufactures were carried on there, nor can I say whether brick or iron tools were made here, or both. It was clay that was exposed to the action of fire. Iron ore in this country is sometimes found in such clay."
In Alma, chapters 49 and 50, it speaks of fortifications Moroni caused to be erected, both of heaps of earth and with timbers. These are more clues into finding the remains of a similar culture. In the book Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, the first ever publication from the Smithsonian in 1848, Squire and Davis map out many of the ancient structures that were once inhabited by the Mississippi and Hopewell cultures. Part of these series of mounds include what experts think were forts used to protect a people in battle. One in particular is Fort Ancient in southern Ohio. This grand structure made of earth has similar features like that of other proposed forts, usually built on a hill or a low ditch and a high wall, making it difficult for the enemy to enter. Fortified Hill, also in southern Ohio, has a strategic entryway making it difficult for the enemy to enter before they are caught by surprise. Another place that has become rich in archaeological findings is the surrounding area of Nauvoo, Illinois.
The red flags that go up through there show where the wall went, and it drops off everywhere steeply. And
Here, Wilson and Janice Curley show their property. The entire 18 acres rests upon a hill with an obvious ramp that could have been man-made.
This ramp was the entrance to the fortification. And we've got some sticks in the ground to show it.
Evidence of this are the remaining post molds where wood walls could have been erected. Wood remains were found in the post molds.
And so these are where the two towers were, and this was the place of entrance. And up there, that hole is where we dug down about 18 inches and stuck a probe in and came up with some wood fibers.
In the short walk with the Curleys around the property, 17 possible burial mounds were identified.
Well, we had been coming here summers for a number of years, and the spirit of place, the feeling in Nauvoo, was something that every time we would come here, we would feel like we wanted to come back. And we thought, well, our kids live all over the country, so we could retire anywhere we wanted to. So we bought a home here, and shortly after that, we discovered the mounds.
Yeah, that's a mound right down there on the side hill.
As soon as we saw them, the first words out of Jenny's mouth were, "I've got to take care of these."
We started to ask the questions, and we found that one lot was not owned with the rest of them because it belonged to the surveyor who had done the original platting 40-some years ago. And in finding out who she was through the records in Carthage, she was living in Texas, a widow. We bought that first lot. So we call it the homestead. And we put all of our heart into that. And it had two major state-certified large mounds on it. But since, in cleaning them up, we've discovered there's literally many, many dozens.
I think it was 1973, if I'm not mistaken, that the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee certified it as a mound group, ancient burials. And about 8 or so years ago, the state of Illinois hired an archaeologist to do a survey, and he verified that there were 10 large burial mounds there. That's what we knew was up there. But since then, with the help of others who are much more expert than us, and as well as when you clean up the forest floor, you can see things, little undulations in the ground and so forth. Literally dozens, hundreds of other burials up there. The whole 20 acres is a large burial ground. You can't walk really anywhere without being in it and walking on burials that you're not even aware are there.
Many mounds that do exist anymore, they're in state parks, or they're controlled, or they're on private property, or some not out in fields. People, you can't go to them. Our first goal has made it so that people can visit this area freely. Yes, our house is ours, but that's all. It belongs to us legally, but it's for everyone else's enjoyment or to meditate. Native Americans have held ceremonies, even some Maoris have come up and held ceremony. It feels very good to know that it's accessible.
With the construction of the Nauvoo Temple, as well as the preservation of the city itself, many artifacts have been unearthed from the Nauvoo era of the church. I Dig Nauvoo is a program in which members of both the Community of Christ and the LDS faith work together to preserve these artifacts.
Beginning at about 10 feet from the store, where the trench came through to put this electrical conduit in, the trencher ran into bone. And as the archaeologist working on the neighboring site, I just walked along the trench to see what had been kicked up, and I found bone.
Community of Christ archaeologist Paul DeBarth shows us that if you dig deeper, you'll find a culture that resided here long before the saints.
One of my students picked up a tiny piece of red finished stone. It was a cut and polished piece of catlinite. I told him it's pipestone, go find the rest of it, knowing full well that his chances of doing that were remote. And about a minute later, with his eyes as big as saucers, he pointed out, there it is. Well, it's a cardinal platform pipe, typical of the Hopewell people, and a beautiful sample of the kind of funeral offering that they often gave. There's several hundred of those that have been found. Ken Farnsworth, the archaeologist in the state of Illinois, who is the foremost specialist on them, acknowledges it as one of the very best. But we're talking here about a system that made this place sacred 2,000 years ago.
People say all the time, it doesn't matter where it happened, it just matters that it happened. It does matter.
The community worried, what in the heck is happening up at Nauvoo?
Joseph was killed in the middle of his candidacy for president.
Hidden in the Heartland.